Good afternoon, everyone. Buon pomeriggio, welcome in this beautiful venue. My name is Antonio Zappulla. I'm CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where we work to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies through media, legal, and data-driven initiatives. And today we want to talk about foreign agent laws, because we've been doing a lot of work in this area, and we really want to look in this session at the way foreign agent laws are being weaponized by autocratic regimes to essentially silence dissent, whether it is dissent that is coming from the media, but also dissent that is coming from civil society organizations. And just as we start this conversation, just a reminder of what foreign agent laws are technically meant to be, or the way they are phrased. They require people that receive foreign funding to register as foreign agents or organizations that are serving the interests of a foreign power. So potentially, obviously, this is leading to significant challenges and restrictions in the operations of these organizations, and obviously they bring also a lot of stigma when it comes to the work that they're doing. In reality, we know that these laws are designed to weaponize law and really to silence media freedom in different ways. Also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, these laws are very vague, intentionally written in a very vague language that obviously can have, as we will see with real-life examples, very harmful consequences for people and for democracy. Also, these foreign agent laws have been found to violate freedom of association and freedom of expression by many international bodies, including the UN Human Rights Committee, the European Court of Human Rights, the Venice Commission at the Council of Europe. So we're going to be assessing what these legislations, these pieces of legislation are meant to be for, how they actually weaponized, and we're going to be having obviously real-life examples of the impact that this legislation has had on people and civil society. I'm delighted to be joined by Alsu Kurmasheva, who is a press freedom advocate and former reporter at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Jan Yinsu, who is the deputy chair of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. So I'd like to start with you, Alsu, because you spent many years of your career working for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty on their Tatar service. In May 2023, you traveled to Kazan, who's the capital of Tatarstan, to visit your mother, who was ill at the time. And on your way back to the US, you were arrested for not disclosing your dual citizenship, so American and Russian citizenship. 5 months later, you were put under house arrest at the time. Then 5 months later, you were charged for not registering as a foreign agent because of this dual nationality, and that was the first time a Russian citizen had been charged under this law. You were arrested and detained at the time, and whilst in custody, 2 months later, in December of that year, you were hit with more serious allegations of spreading fake news. After spending 9 months in detention, you were in fact convicted of spreading fake news again about the Russian army. The trial was held in secret, and you were convicted for a period of 6.5 months in prison, spending 6 months in isolation. One of the things that really struck me when we spoke ahead of this panel is that you said that whilst in prison, you tried to behave as a journalist. And so use this as an opportunity to have incredible access into the lives of prisoners of conscience in Russia. Can you tell us more about that?
Thank you, Antonio. I'm so happy to share this stage and this room with all of you. You should be very dedicated to come to such a focused, a very difficult panel discussion.
After lunch.
After lunch. I spent in prison, 288 days, 40 Fridays. I counted by Fridays because Friday is my favorite day. The first couple of months were brutal. I was still naive. I was still waiting for that thick metal door with multiple chains and locks to open, and somebody would say, Alsu, this was a terrible mistake. We apologize. You are free to go. And then I vividly remember December 1st, 2023, when my detention was extended to 2 months, which meant that I would spend Christmas, New Year's, and New Year holidays there. And those holidays were stolen from me and my family and my children. And then I realized that I have to use my skill as a journalist to try to connect to people in prison, to the guards, to investigators. Before that, I hated that idea. I realized that I was the first and hopefully the last American Russian journalist to be in prison and to listen to those stories, but I hated the idea of it. But then, December 1st, I came back to that dark cell and looked at things differently. Yes, it was a horrible cell, but there were people there, and not all of them were criminals. And so I used my skill. I tried to connect, and at the next court hearing, the courtroom was packed with journalists, with local journalists who didn't dare to ask me anything. They were just filming and taking pictures. I stepped up and I said, do you want to ask me anything? And nobody said anything, but I started talking. I realized that I have a minute or two before the judge comes back with the ruling, and doesn't matter. Maybe they won't allow those journalists to put that online or something. But I said, okay, that's the journalist's job. They can find a way. So I talk about my conditions, and actually that video made a big difference. When it was the first time when my family heard my voice, because I was deprived of any telephone calls, visits from my family. Then you see the photo. It was June 1st, one of the court hearings, and I got this postcard from somebody in Russia, I believe in Siberia, somebody, graphic designers, they sent me this card. It's the advocacy campaign in Russia. So I used that one, and that photo was very popular. So this is, once a journalist, I think nobody can stop being a journalist, and I've always enjoyed my profession, and actually it helped me to be free.
Because a journalist is always a journalist, regardless of the environment, you said that you were able to keep a diary despite the fact that you were not allowed to write any notes about the situation that you were experiencing, and you wrote some sort of coded diary. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I witnessed how diaries and journals of other women prisoners were taken away and never given back. And I decided to keep a very short diary, putting just initials or numbers or emotions or something. And I was so afraid that I would forget something. Actually, it's been 8 months since I was released. I didn't forget anything, and I don't even have to go to that detail. I remember very well what I was doing this day last year. Maybe it's not good. I have to talk to the therapist. Maybe I should forget some things, but those things will stay with me forever. But I tried to write as many letters as I could to my friends and people I didn't know. So just to tell the story about me. Sometimes I had to be creative. It's another journalistic skill. When there is censorship, you have to be creative. So sometimes I would write as if not about myself, but about a TV show I saw on TV, or about somebody, or about a book I read. But my friends would figure out that I was writing about myself. This is how I was telling my story from inside the prison.
And Jan, of course, you were representing Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty because of the situation with foreign agent laws. Your experience as a lawyer in this case has been quite interesting because you won. You brought the case to the European Court of Human Rights and you won. Can you explain practically what you did and also practically what that means? And if it was a resounding victory, if you're happy with the results that you've achieved?
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you to you and Thomson Reuters for convening us. I think this is a very, very timely discussion. I mean, so far as the case was concerned, obviously this was a case in the European Court of Human Rights challenging the foreign agents law in the European Court of Human Rights against the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, it was one of these cases where, you know, justice delayed can be justice denied, in that, you know, we went to the court straight away once Russia really sped up the application of this law. So for those of you not familiar, foreign agents law is not new in Russia. They started being introduced in 2012, but there were legislative amendments such that the initial targets were the NGOs, and that moved to lawyers, and it moved to media organizations. And the fines and the potential criminal sanctions just got worse and worse over time. The point at which we intervened is when Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was told by the Russian state that it had to impose a labeling requirement on every single piece of content, and the wording in this labeling requirement was the same, and it had to attach to every single tweet, news article, any content published by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and in that label it would say that this is the product of an organization designated as a foreign agent. And the European Court of Human Rights took this case and essentially found that the Russian Federation was in violation of its obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. So we got a declaration that this was unlawful. Unusually for the European Court of Human Rights, it provided Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty with a very substantial award in damages, notwithstanding the fact that the article which we sued under, Article 10, the right to freedom of expression, media freedom, under the convention, isn't usually used to get damages. But of course, what happened from the start to the end of the legislation, well, Russia was thrown out of the Council of Europe. The journalists in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had to leave Russia urgently. We did ask the court to grant an injunction to sort of pause the application of all of this legislation. The court didn't do that. So unfortunately, journalists had to leave. I think there's over 1,600 journalists in exile as a result. So the reason that this is so important is because, of course, a judgment against Russia is not only a judgment against Russia. If it comes from the European Court of Human Rights, it's actually a judgment that has precedential value across all Council of Europe member states. And we can perhaps come on to some of the other countries that have started tabling this legislation to talk about the effect of this judgment.
We'll come to that in a minute and talk about the spread of foreign agent laws and the trends that are emerging. I want to go quickly back to you also, because when it became known to the world that you were a political prisoner, you started getting international support. In this picture, I mean, it comes from Russia, but it does show the fact that your case was becoming was gaining visibility. Did you have a sense of the scale of the advocacy campaign that was taking place while you were there? And do you think that the case against you was a precedent, an attempt to intimidate the wider community?
Well, definitely it was done to stop other journalists from working and from doing their job, which we at RFE always faced harassment and intimidation from authoritarian regimes, and traveling to Russia to take care of my sick mom was always a battle between my mind and my soul. But we have, in a free world, we have values, right? We have family is a primarily value, so I had to go. And yes, it was a very clear sign from the authorities: don't travel, don't work, don't cover Russia, don't keep the population, the audience there in the dark. That was it, and I had no idea about the scale of the advocacy campaign. Once I was designated as a political prisoner in Russia by the human rights organization called Memorial, I realized that the scale was growing, because I knew what it meant. I knew that that designation was very important to open certain doors for advocacy. And you know, we were so overjoyed yesterday at the news that Ksenia Karelina, another dual Russian-American citizen, was freed, and she returned home and reunited with her loved ones. And everybody rushed to you know, say thank you to very specific people and leaders. Those kinds of things, the advocacy goes on for months and months. And I'm so grateful every morning, every day. I'm so grateful to lawyers, to advocacy organizations like yours, Antonio, to everybody, every journalist who kept my name and my case on spotlight, and governmental organizations everywhere in America, in Europe, in all other countries around the world. I was getting letters of support from all around the globe, from Mexico, from America. Actually, the postcards and letters from the United States came faster to Russia than from Europe. That was interesting. So I got lots of postcards from Italy. When I got released, I realized that Russians in exile had organized an amazing job of like supporting political prisoners in Russia, and I was amazed at the scale of that support. Otherwise, I was very isolated. I was picking up the pieces of information from different sources, from the letters, and I was subscribed to the very last independent newspaper in Russia. It has been, it's not there anymore. It's Собеседник. My friend subscribed it, and you know what was happening? So it was a weekly newspaper, and it wouldn't be delivered to me for a very long time. And then I was asking the guards where the newspaper was, and once I saw it on the desk of the prisoner guards, so they were reading it. And instead of being mad for that, I was so happy that they had access to good quality information through me, at least. So nobody believes the propaganda there, but they have to consume it because there are no other sources of information.
Jen, I want to speak about the impact of advocacy, international advocacy, in the context of a situation like Alsus, right? So oftentimes, there is almost a validation through the advocacy that takes place internationally. We've seen this with our colleague Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who's, repeating again, not a journalist, but was in a similar situation, obviously, in Iran. And the advocacy that Richard, her husband, was doing, and internationally, obviously, was often played against her, and I guess similarly in your case also, as almost reconfirming that indeed you were proving the point that you were a spy. Can you talk to that, and also what is the level of stigma that contributes to creating when it comes to people like Alsu?
Well, also obviously, you know, you felt it very directly, the level of stigma. This is a part of the playbook. So just taking one step back, these sorts of regimes, the first thing they want to do is cut off sources of funding. So before we come to individual journalists, sources of funding to journalists, to human rights defenders, etc. First, they look domestically, and they make sure that no business domestically is ever going to advertise in a newspaper that is not pro-regime, right? So they cut off the domestic funding. Then what they do is they start tabling legislation against foreign interference, foreign agents laws, etc., because then they want to cut off the funding that might come from abroad. And of course, what they do along the way is they pick case study journalists and target them and create a real stigma around the label that they are designating them with. So I also can speak to this directly about the actual language used in Russia, designation, but it's quite clear that in all of these jurisdictions, not just Russia, all of these jurisdictions, they are trying to use the language of espionage, of shadowy forces, to make you the other so that you will not be trusted. And of course, as you say, Antonio, if you're not careful in your advocacy efforts, you can end up confirming the very stigma that the government is trying to attach, whether it's to individual journalists or to media outlets. What I would say is there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this, and one needs to be very, very context-specific. And there are examples of countries that table this legislation, then pull them back, and we can talk about that in due course.
Do you want to add to how we felt, and if you also are happy to articulate the kind of language that was used, if you feel comfortable in sharing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to follow up. So suddenly, I would be, my conditions would get worse. I would be put to a isolated cell with a hole instead of the toilet, and no hot water, and everything would go like worse and worse. And then a couple of days later, when my lawyer would come, or I would receive a note from my friends, I would realize that something was going on, say like an important statement was made somewhere in the United States or in Europe, or the major interview on a major television network was out with my daughter. Actually, that happened when I didn't even know what was happening, because suddenly they took me out of my cell in the middle of the night and they just moved me to another cell. I was like, what was happening? And then that stigma, that the reputation of me in prison, of me being an agent. I was called an agent, though I'm still not a foreign agent and I'm not on the list officially. But my case was so dangerous to others and to prisoner guards. Like, nobody talked to me, which was good. It was like I was isolated a little bit. Everybody was so scared of approaching. Because we all grew up with those books and movies about Gulag, right? Political prisoners, how dangerous it is to interact with political prisoners. You might get another charge additionally to some drug deal or something. That was it. And this is when it took me months to realize that. And the lawyers helped, of course, and to understand that what was happening. So it was very irritating for them too. And of course they were sure I was an agent, because in that country, unfortunately, they don't have a concept of free journalism. They don't have a history of that, a long history. There were periods, but they don't have a history. So they are not educated to live in a society where there is free journalism.
Do you want to interject before we move on?
I was just going to say, I mean, of course, this is also dehumanizing. And, you know, as a lawyer based in, whether it's in Russia or Georgia or Venezuela or Kyrgyzstan, all of these countries, it's hard enough as a lawyer trying to represent someone who's been attacked by the government. But, you know, if they are designated as a foreign agent, it makes it even harder to find lawyers who are willing, because guess what happens? You find yourself as a lawyer yourself designated as a foreign agent because you're willing to represent someone else who's been designated as a foreign agent. So there is no, it's one way, and it is a very, very powerful way, if we don't resist it, of shutting down independent journalism, human rights defenders, and independent lawyers in any given jurisdiction.
And I'm glad you're making the point and the link between the journalists and the lawyers that protect these journalists, because, you know, you're part of the same equation oftentimes. I would like to zoom out of Russia for a second, and you mentioned Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. Those are two of the latest countries that have adopted foreign agent laws. Last year, we've seen Hungary in 2023, Nicaragua in 2020. Can you help us understand, Jan, two things? A, how big of a trend this is, and B, if you can bring examples of where cases of where this proposed legislation was actually pulled out or, you know, stopped because of actions that were taken either by the international community or civil society organizations in country.
Yeah, of course. So I just want to give everyone a snapshot of just a few months in 2024, just to give you a sense of how timely this discussion is and how urgently we have to act as a community against this new trend. April 2024, Kyrgyzstan. Law came into force. May 2024, Georgia, August 2024, Venezuela, October 2024, Turkey put in a draft bill, November 2024, Paraguay, and Georgia moved with a new piece of legislation just last month. So, and that's not everything, right? So countries are moving very, very quickly. Russia, Nicaragua have got quite a lot of press. Georgia's got quite a lot of press. There have been some jurisdictions where there's been almost no press at all. So the spread is incredible and very worrying. The reason that cases like the case that RFE, RL, and other applicants brought to the European Court of Human Rights are so important is because judgments like that can make a difference to the adoption of such laws, especially somewhere like the Council of Europe. But there's an interesting thing going on here. You asked about countries that tabled and then withdrew. So there are a few of these. We, as you know, putting on another hat, I sit on a panel of legal experts that's charged with advising 52 states, Media Freedom Coalition of States, currently chaired by Germany and Estonia, and we're getting more and more requests to review legislation. What I found very interesting is there are some countries, and we might learn before it becomes public, and once they know that a body may review, they actually sometimes put legislation on ice. And I'm not at liberty to talk about those examples, but I am at liberty to talk about a public example. Country I was born, Turkey. So Turkey put forward a pretty sophisticated foreign agents bill in October 2024, and it pulled it back in November 2024. In between it tabling the legislation, pulling it back, we got judgment from the European Court of Human Rights in the RFE-RL case. But also there was a sense that if you are in charge of the economy of a country that is trying to attract foreign direct investment, like Turkey, and Turkey is not alone, that actually tabling a bill like this doesn't help. Because you're telling all of these foreign investors to come and invest and how you'll be treated extremely well and how all these protections in international law. And then in another part of your economy, you're saying, well, actually, we need to look at this, foreign influence issue. And it goes beyond foreign influence through states. We're talking about NGOs. We're talking about media organizations, etc. So this is, depending on the country, this is I think, could go both ways for countries. And I think countries with sophisticated open economies are realizing that there could be a real cost to introducing this kind of legislation.
And you mentioned FDI, foreign direct investment. Is Turkey an isolated example, or have you seen FDI working as a deterrent, the damage, obviously, that this could do to FDI also in other parts of the world?
Certainly not. And what's very interesting, in terms of what we're trying to do, I'm conscious in a room full of journalists, human rights defenders, but also lawyers, is actually one of the most effective things you can do is not go to the human rights departments or ministries of justice, etc., but actually go to the treasury ministries, go to the ministries that are charged with improving the economic condition in a country. And I won't say this will always work, but you would be surprised, especially open economies, you'd be surprised about how effective that advocacy can be. In terms of combating this sort of legislation.
So going back to you, you spoke about the conditions in prison. We just heard you earlier talking about the isolation, the stigma. At which point you realized that your ordeal was coming to an end?
For the last 3 months in detention, I was moved to a bigger cell with slightly better conditions. And the cell was for 10 women. And finally, there was a door to the bathroom. I'm sorry for, mentioning all those details, but For women in prison, in Russian prisons, is much more difficult than for men. A couple of reasons: not being able to have your basic hygiene, not having hot water in winter, not having a mirror. I saw myself in a mirror for the first time in Ankara when I was exchanged. When that happens every day, day after day, it takes over, and it's so easy to lose sanity. And women are very intimidated in that male-dominated environment, and it doesn't come only from in prison. I'm not going to be talking about the society, but women can't stand against the prisoner guards and administration physically, so they express aggression towards each other. And I witnessed many ugly situations. I was so happy that there was no violence against me, but I was a witness of many. So when I was transferred to a different cell, I realized that maybe something was going on there. And actually, the interrogator one day said that there might be a deal, that I have to wait. And my trials were rushed. And then I realized that Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal journalist who was released with me, his trials were on the same day. It gave me hope. So that happened in July, and then there was nothing again. So I was just in a cell waiting. And then I was taken to Moscow again, as that system that deprives you of dignity. That they do it when you least expect it. It was very early in the morning, Saturday, and usually nothing happens on Saturdays and Sundays in prison, so the prisoners can give themselves a little break, though the wake-up time and going to bed is the same, but still. So it was Saturday morning. I was given 10 minutes to pack and go. And I was told that I was going to a very different location than Moscow. So again, that fear came back. And but I had to take that step to go out of the cell, because that was the only step to freedom.
And that was the day when you were released?
No, that was a week before I was released. They took me to Moscow. I spent 4 days in notorious Lefortovo prison, and then I was released.
We have a picture of you on the plane with Evan Gershkovich. I'm curious to know, what did you speak about? I mean, obviously you were released at the same time. Did you know each other? What did you speak?
Well, we saw each other for the first time, of course. We met there, but we knew a lot about each other. And our families were advocating for both of us together. So my family knew his family in the United States. And, I mean, we are a family now.
We have pictures of your release, the day when you were released, both you and Evan. And we have pictures also when you met your daughters again. I would like to talk about the emotional toll that this obviously takes on someone like you, the level of support that you've been receiving. Obviously, when the advocacy ends and we see pictures like this, we're all very happy and overjoyed. But what is the journey towards recovery? And do you think people in your position are getting the right level of support? Do you even think that the community, the community of journalists, the community of people that, after today will go back to our own countries and do advocacy or whatever are able to look after people who've gone through this ordeal?
Thank you. Looking at those pictures brings me back to those wonderful moments that I will never forget. Like this photo, like this might happen once in a lifetime and not to every child. And at that point, I don't think my daughter realized that hugging the US president is like a big deal. For her, the big deal was that she will see her mom, and that will stay with her forever. And you know what we can do? Let's not forget about journalists in Russian prisons, in Belarus and other countries. We all can do something. Sometimes we think like, oh, okay, I'm such a small person, what can I do? We can do a lot. Supporting them by letters, trying to raise their awareness. Right now, I don't even know the exact number of political prisoners in Russia, but it's very high. They say it's even higher than during Gulag times. But there are more than 20 journalists in Russia, and one of them is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty journalist Nika Novak. I'm very worried about her, and I try to talk about her everywhere I can, and I really believe the more we talk about her, she will feel it, and it will be easier for her in prison, but not immediate. She might get to a solitary confinement after my words, but she knows that that's important for her freedom. Now we are going, at RFE, we're going through a very turbulent times with funding cuts, but we, at this point, this stage of life, I don't like the word hope, though we need to use it. I like strategy and I like planning. And when there is no strategy, I mean, hope is kind of useless. So here, what we have at RFE, we have an audience that we can't betray. We've built the trust with the audience who trust us for 75 years. They will stay there. They will stay with us. And we have an amazing, amazing, talented people at RFE. They will also stay. They won't go anywhere far. So whatever future prepared for us, we have to stay together, and I heard so much support during the panels here at Perugia, and we should cooperate and we should work together. This is what everyone can do, like smaller things. You know, the art of small steps, that's my strategy always.
Jan, I'd like to go back to you on what can we actually do. We've spoken about small steps. Obviously, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty is a perfect fitting example given the funding crisis that they are experiencing. You spoke about FDI. Is there anything in between that can be done, between a letter of support to another also in prison or somebody writing to the treasury of a country?
Thank you very much. And just looking at those photographs, I mean, it's also, it's in many respects extremely surreal for me because I did a lot of work with the Dow Jones team, with Evan Gershkovich, and first time in my professional career, meeting their families and just seeing actually, how strong and tall they were standing was extremely humbling. And I think that now meeting also, I mean, when we met, we spoke in Turkish, which was extremely surreal. But, there is hope in all of this. I mean, in that situation, I saw how hard Dow Jones worked, how hard USG worked, how much solidarity there was from the other media organizations, and we were all in very, very close touch. But so far as this legislation is concerned, we need to be very, very clear-minded. First, it's not realistic to say that there's going to be no foreign agent laws. You're going to start seeing foreign agent laws in countries like Italy, in the United Kingdom. Foreign influence, illegitimate foreign influence, is an issue, right? So the fact, just like disinformation, is an issue. So the devil is in the detail, and rather than saying there can't be any of this legislation, what we need to do is we need to look at legislation like this very, very closely, and we need to make sure that it's being deployed properly to combat legitimate aims. That's not what's happened to date.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Because obviously we've seen a massive, massive Russian influence in the German elections, the latest rounds of elections that we had here in Europe. So to your point, there is some validity into the will to counter this malign influence. But where do you draw the line between what's malign, who defines what malign influence is, and at which point, because of the vagueness of this language, you step in and say, this legislation, I get the intent, but if it would go through Parliament at this level, in this stage, will actually harm civil society and the media?
Well, again, I'm afraid that I'm going to use the example of disinformation laws. So I think there'll be very few of you in this room who doesn't think disinformation is a problem. But I think you'd also agree that a lot of the disinformation legislation is also a problem, because the last thing it's trying to do is combat true disinformation, and the first thing it's trying to do is shut down independent media. We've got the same issue going on here. So what's going to happen, and what I think we're going to see, and which is why bodies like the Venice Commission in the Council of Europe, who reviews legislation in Council of Europe states, or the European Court of Human Rights, these judgments are really, really important. Georgia already has tabled new legislation because it knows that the European Court of Human Rights is looking at its old legislation. And so I think states are going to become more and more sophisticated. Bad actors are going to become more and more sophisticated, but the biggest danger is that the good actors fall into the trap of passing some of this legislation. So as a lawyer, all I can say is that one needs to look at the detail, and vague legislation is always misused, as we all well know. But even if legislation is set out in narrow terms, there needs to be an independent judiciary, right? There need to be independent lawyers that can...
That's not often the case, as we know.
Well, quite. But in the Council of Europe, you may have a chance. So this is not going to go away. And I would say that the democracies also have to be very, very careful when they look at their own policies and legislation combating foreign influence in their own political affairs.
Let's open this up to the room and see if there's any questions from the floor that we can take. And can you please identify yourself, tell us who you're working for, so that will give a little bit more context perhaps to the question that you are about to ask. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Arzu Gebula. I'm not a foreign agent. I am an independent journalist and I collaborate with various international media. I have two questions, one on advocacy solidarity and one on the foreign agent bill. From the perspective of international advocacy, I come from a country where journalists are jailed on a regular basis. Right now we have more than 20 journalists in Azerbaijan behind bars. And one thing I find really hard is in the circle of advocacy, it is becoming extremely difficult to keep asking for help when governments that used to help us and institutions that used to help us feel overwhelmed because it doesn't end, right? It's an ongoing process, and not just in Azerbaijan, it's in many countries. So how do we sustain that solidarity in advocacy world when we have this fatigue, but also when we have more stakeholders in the Western world also become nationalists, populists, and where we see a profound government change? And the second question is on the legislation. Is there also a place for foreign donors to reconsider how they should be structuring how they fund in order to avoid their local partners, whether it's journalists, newsrooms, or NGOs, not being labeled foreign agents because of the foreign funding?
It's great question. So maybe Arzu, you wanted to take the first one, and you can talk about the second one, John.
I will be brief. Arzu, thank you for your question. Keep asking. There is money there. Keep asking. I just heard on several panels here from people who have money. They don't hear enough questions. They don't hear what they want to hear from us journalists or from advocates, what exactly we need. Sometimes, you know, we journalists, we live in our bubble and we think everybody knows what we are doing, but it's not true. So we have to learn how to speak to people who have money. This is what I learned here in Perugia. And the second thing, RF Ural has a journalist in jail right now, Farid Mirkhalizadeh. He's an economist. He's in Baku. He has a wonderful family, a baby girl. Let's be creative in telling the stories of our imprisoned colleagues. And that's our journalistic skill too, because those human stories, personal stories, and John, thank you so much. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was crying when I was released. Yeah. When I saw that video later, I said, oh my gosh, National Security Advisor being emotional, it tells something. So the story can be told the way that people will hear it. So yeah, that's my answer.
I've got to say, it's not that I ordinarily wobble either, but it's having seen those photographs, it's impossible not to, having gone through all that. Great question, and I'm going to borrow an answer I heard earlier today in the panel between Keelan Gallagher, or the fireside between Keelan Gallagher and Karen. So we've got to be much more creative. So you're talking about structuring, absolutely right. As lawyers, and Keelan and I talk about this all the time, you know, ordinarily we think in these sorts of gatherings, conversations through international human rights. But just as the bad actors are becoming more creative in the laws that they are using, we have to be more creative, not only in our defenses, but also in our counterclaims. And your question goes to that directly. A lot of these countries do want foreign investment, or at least they want to look like there are good places for foreign investment. And a lot of the capital exporting states are a lot of the states that actually support independent journalism. So if those donors, funders, whether at the state level or at the independent level, actually structure that funding and that support in a way that secures specific protections under treaties. These treaties already exist, and they're not human rights treaties. They're international economic law treaties. If they do it in that way, then they get the protection. And the government thinks, oh, if I do this, it's going to have even bigger consequences than, you know, one media organization. I'm actually dealing at that point not with a single media organization, but all of the investments of a single state. And those investments, as we've seen on in the news recently with tariffs, etc., I mean, these are extremely substantial. Extremely substantial.
That's a very strong point. I would like to squeeze another question in. We go Keelan on the front row. I will always take a question from Keelan.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid it's a comment, not a question, but I'm not going to apologise for it, given what I'm saying, which is also, you are obviously part of the club no one wants to be in. And one of the things which is so incredibly moving and which should motivate everyone in this room is someone like Alsu, who has walked through fire to be here and who could quite easily go back to her life and spend her time with her family, and is here advocating for others to stop other people going through what she's going through. I spent the last few days with Jason Rezaian, who 10 years ago spent time in prison in Iran, with Matthew Caruana Galizia, whose mother was killed for being a journalist, with Maria Ressa, with people who've gone through hell to be here in this room and in Perugia this week. And if they can focus on imprisoned journalists worldwide and give their time and their effort and their dedication to it, we must dig deep and do all we can. Thank you.
Do we have time for another one? We have time for another quick question. I saw you first, so the lady in the red coat.
Hello, I am from Georgia, and my question is to Alsu first. What advice do you have? What mistakes we should prevent? And second question is about legislation. You rightly mentioned the disinformation laws, but could we consider this family protection law as a package to regulate content and interfere in editorial decisions, because our government already removed the gender from all legislative pieces and plans to regulate content not to propagate the gay marriage in our society? Thank you.
My thoughts and prayers are with Georgian journalists these days, and I see how Georgia events are fading from the international news agenda. It's very sad to see. So I'm the last person to give advice here, but if you observe what was happening in Russia, first Belarus, then Russia, and all those countries, unfortunately, it's inevitable, but we have hope, right? And I hope lawyers have strategy the other way.
Look, I mean, Georgia, I'm doing 4 different cases against Georgia in the European Court of Human Rights. And it is obviously, I'm not going to tell you how difficult it is. My mother is originally of Georgian origin, but look, they're doing all of this, and the government is also counting on the fact that international justice especially is very, very slow. But they've already had to table new legislation on foreign agents because they know that the old legislation won't work. So my message is we have to, at the domestic level and in the international level, do everything we can to continue to put pressure, whether it's by way of defense or whether it's by way of countermeasure. Georgia is a very interesting country in that, you know, the Georgian economy, there is not lots and lots of sort of easy resources. It's going to catch up with them. If they close the economy, it's going to catch up with them. So at the moment, we're seeing the international battles at the international human rights fora, but we also need to think about the international economic fora. But what I would say is we need to keep taking the cases to those fora and asking independent judges to rule.
Okay, we have time. I just wanted to thank you also for sharing your story, your personal story. That's really a privilege to have you here with us. Thank you, Jan, for your formidable expertise and for the work that you continue doing. And thank you, all of you, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.